They tell you stories of glory before you sign up. They talk about honor, about heroes, about a swift victory. They don't mention the mud. The mud is the first thing that gets you. It gets in your boots. It weighs down your uniform. It chokes the light out of the world. It's thick, gray, and it smells like a mixture of fertilizer and despair. My name is Thomas, private, barely 20 years old. I'm from a quiet village in England where the most exciting thing that happened before the war was the vicar getting a new bicycle. Now, I'm in a trench somewhere near the Somme, listening to the rainfall and the distant rumble of the German artillery, which sounds less like thunder and more like the world is chewing on its own bones. We'd been in this section of trench for 4 days straight. 4 days of standing in water up to our shins, trying to keep our rifles clean and our spirits, theoretically, high. We were supposed to go over the top at dawn tomorrow. The sergeant, a man named Davies who looked like he'd aged 20 years in the past too, told us we were the point of the spear. We were the ones who were going to break through the German lines, walk right into Berlin, and have tea with the Kaiser, probably. No one laughed at his joke. We just looked at the barbed wire and the churned-up earth that used to be a farm field. My best friend was a bloke named Jack. He was a few years older than me, had a wife and a kid back home he never stopped talking about. He kept a picture of them tucked into the inside pocket of his tunic, wrapped in oilskin to keep the wet out. That picture was his shield, his hope, his reason for everything. Last night, during the ration run, he'd managed to trade 3 cigarettes for a small tin of treacle. He was saving it for a special occasion. He said that we were sitting there, waiting for dawn, the anticipation a cold knot in my gut. The sky was the color of a bruise. The shelling started a few hours before we were meant to move. Not the distant rumble this time. This was close. Whump, whump, whump. Earth and fire and metal raining down around us. The trench walls shook. Jack and I were huddled together, just trying to make ourselves smaller, trying to become invisible to the death falling from the sky. A massive shell hit maybe 10 yards from our section. The sound was a physical blow. The trench collapsed inwards, a torrent of mud and splintered wood. I was buried up to my chest. Couldn't move my arms. I heard Jack cry out, a sharp, raw sound of pain. I thrashed and fought the mud, my lungs tight with panic. The shelling was relentless. I could just see his hand, reaching out from the new wall of mud that had caved in, reaching for the air that was quickly running out. His tunic was torn, and the picture of his family, the oilskin cover ripped away, was floating in the gray water at the bottom of the trench. I reached for him, but my arms were trapped, uselessly pinned by the mud. The world was screaming around us, but all I could hear was the quiet, desperate look in his eyes as he sank, the mud swallowing him whole. The glory they promised felt a million miles away, replaced by the grim reality that dawn hadn't even broken yet. I don't know how long I was trapped. Time stopped making sense. The world was just noise and fear. When the shelling finally stopped, the silence was deafening, broken only by the whimpering of a few men and the groans of the wounded. Someone dug me out of the mud, hauling me up by my collar. It was Sergeant Davies. His face was pale, his eyes wide and haunted. He didn't say anything about Jack. There was nothing to say. We all knew. I was just another lucky one who made it. Fix bayonets, lads. Davies rasped, his voice barely a whisper. Dawn's here. The whistles started blowing. Shrill, piercing things that cut through the morning mist and cut right through your stomach. That was the signal. Go time. We were supposed to attack the German lines, walk right into the machine gun fire that we all knew was waiting for us. There was no glory in it, only duty and a cold, heavy resignation. That I climbed the ladder, stepping over the crumpled, mud-covered bodies of the men who didn't make it up the side of the trench. The mist was thick, clinging to the barbed wire like spiderwebs. Ahead of me were maybe 50 yards of no man's land, a churned-up wasteland of shell craters and death. The ground was slick with water and slicker with blood. We advanced in a slow walk. That was the order, walk. They said running would just tire us out faster and break formation. A walk into the firing squad. The Germans hadn't started shooting yet, which felt worse. The silence amplified every footstep, every heavy breath. My rifle felt like a foreign object in my hands. I kept thinking about Jack's picture floating in the mud, about the treacle tin in his pocket. Then the machine guns started. The air around me suddenly filled with the sound of angry wasps. Zip, zip, zip. Men started falling, not with heroic cries or dramatic gestures, but just collapsing. They stumbled, fell into the mud, and stayed down. I tripped over a body, falling face first into a crater full of stagnant, green water. When I lifted my head, panting, I saw Sergeant Davies fall backwards. A hole in his chest where his heart used to be. I ran. Orders be damned, I ran. I zigzagged through the craters, ignoring the screams, ignoring the bullets kicking up dirt around my boots. I wasn't thinking about breaking through to Berlin anymore. I was thinking about surviving the next 5 seconds. I threw myself behind the sad, splintered remains of a tree trunk, pressing my face into the dirt, waiting for the bullet with my name on it. The world had shrunk down to the size of my breathing. I stayed behind that splintered tree trunk for what felt like hours. The battle raged around me, but that little hollow of earth was its own world. The firing eventually slowed, becoming more sporadic, the shouts of men turning into distant groans. The attack had failed. We were pinned down, or we were dead, or we were prisoners. I hadn't been hit. Not a scratch. I was covered in mud from head to toe, shaking with adrenaline and fear, but alive. A survivor, the luckiest bastard in the Somme. The silence eventually returned, a different kind of silence than before. Heavy with exhaustion and smoke, I risked a look over the edge of my miserable little haven. No man's land was littered with the crumpled khaki forms of the men I'd stood in the trenches with just hours ago. The machine guns were silent now. I spotted movement near the German lines, maybe a patrol checking for survivors or prisoners, but they were too far away. The day stretched on under a sun that seemed indifferent to the death it illuminated. The smell of copper and earth and cordite was overwhelming. I knew I couldn't stay here. If the Germans didn't find me, the night patrols would, or I'd just freeze to death when the sun went down. As dusk began to settle, bringing a cold mist with it, I started to crawl. Slowly, carefully, digging my fingers into the mud, using the shell craters as cover. Every rustle of my uniform sounded like a cannon shot in the stillness. It took me an eternity to cover those 50 yards back toward our lines. My village life felt like a ghost story, something that happened to another boy a lifetime ago. That I made it back to the wire, crawling under the broken strands, scraping my back and tearing my uniform, not caring. I collapsed into the safety of the front trench, falling face first into the same muddy water where Jack's picture floated. Someone hauled me up again. This time it was a different group of men, fresh faces who looked at me like I was a ghost. I was pulled into the dugout, wrapped in a blanket, and handed a cup of something hot that tasted like burnt tires. I sat there, staring at the dirt wall, unable to speak, unable to cry that I survived the Somme. But the boy who signed up for glory, the one who believed the stories, was gone. He was buried somewhere out there in the mud of no man's land, along with Jack and the sergeant and all the others. I was just Thomas now, a quiet soldier who knew the true color of war. Gray, mud-stained, and silent. There were no heroes here, just the living and the dead. The story wasn't about the fighting anymore. It was about the waiting,